Hello and welcome to the Berean Bookclub podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us.
Hello and welcome to season 2 of the Berean Bookclub podcast. It's a new year. It's a new studio.
Yeah.
There's a camera now. Ons is hier.
We're so pumped for the year ahead and all the books that we're going to be reading and discussing with you guys. We can't wait to hear your input. Today we are, what a book to start off with. There's so much to talk about. We're going to be talking about Strange New World by Carl Trueman. An awesome book to understand our time. So this year we're going to be doing stuff a little bit differently here at the Berean Bookclub. Instead of all the chit chat that me and Conrad had, where you guys, all you laughed at us for being clowns, that's going to change. We're just going to jump into the book. We're going to talk about the stuff that really matters, what we are learning from the book, and how it should influence us or can influence us to better equip the church. So with that, I think we should get straight on to this first book.
Yep.
Strange New World by Carl Trueman was really written for the sake of helping Christians understand the times that we are living in, right? And so I think Trueman got a little bit angry at the Christians around him as they engaged in cultural debates. Just going back to the sexual revolution being the start of all the problems. And so the normal critique of the world, at least in the West or in America, is, the sexual revolution is where all the issues are. And if we just go back before the sexual revolution, everything will be okay. And what Trueman does is he actually tries, in the short little book that he wrote, is to give us the intellectual history of how we have come to understand who we are as humans. The modern triumph of the self was his previous book that he just condensed for us in this small little book, Strange New World. And so that's really his purpose, is to give us the intellectual history and comment on some of the technology and all the stuff that has played its part, to get to the place where we understand who we are now. And so, what do you think about the book?
It's perhaps worth saying before we get going that what he's trying to do is not give any answers to any answers to the problem, to put it that way. What he wants for his readers is to understand the world in which we live in before we're able to engage with the world in which we live in. And I think he says as much in his preface or in his introduction. So he's just kind of like coloring in the picture so that we understand the world that we live in, and after the fact we're able to engage better. But he never really goes there. We'll maybe have one or two of those conversations on how we think this may impact how we engage as a church with the world that we live in. But for the most part, he's doing that. He's tracking a history, and we'll be chatting about that most of today.
And I think what's really helpful about this book for us as Christians is the way in which he humbly does so, recognizing that any history that you give, especially if it's over a period of, say, 200-300 years, there are going to be figures that people think are more influential that could play a part. So he recognizes that it's a complex convolution of various thinkers and technologies and social factors that all come together to understanding the modern self. He recognizes that, but he's got enough meat to kind of his narrative to really give it substantial, I think, authority as we talk about these things. So that's good. He kind of he ends that first chapter where he just gives the purpose of the book, just saying that doesn't really matter what you think. This is the strange new world we are living in, and we have to understand it if we are to properly engage the people around us and ourselves and our children with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, yeah, what an awesome book. Let's quickly move on then to kind of his general narrative of
what's the story
of the book. So the story of the rise and triumph of the modern self happens really in three phases. Well, this is how he argues it. First of all, he argues for the psychologizing of the self. So the understanding of the self, be giving primary authority to inner feelings. The inner being, the inner thinking mind is what gives you your identity. He then moves on to show that after the psychologizing of the self, that the next step in this narrative is the sexualizing of psychology, and how we understand psychology primarily in sexual categories, and how that plays an important part. And then the third part is then the politicization of sex. So that's the three movements that happen. First, it's a move inward to the psychological kind of world of understanding ourselves. That psychological world is then sexualized, giving primary authority to our sexual desires. And then the last step is how those sexual desires are then kind of at the forefront of political liberation, and how that influences our culture today. So that's really the story as he wants to sum it up. And the first two thinkers that he deals with the kind of the psychologizing of the self is René Descartes. And Descartes, he's the famous philosopher for a bunch of other things, but he also he made the statement, "I think, therefore I am." And Trueman argues that here Descartes gives us the first formulation of this dualism between the body and the mind, and he gives primary authority to the mind. The place where authority lies is in the assurance comes from the thinking. And so the movement is the separation between the body and the mind, and that the mind is the one that primarily gives us authority. And so Descartes could never imagine the world we live in now, but just conceptually he lays the framework for that. But Trueman then goes on to say that the guy who really takes this forward then is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher, the French philosopher. And in Rousseau's work, we see that he then kind of takes this even further. The two things that Trueman says that Rousseau does is, first, he locates identity in the inner psychological life of the individual. Okay, and then the second thing is he sees that society as exerting a corrupting influence on the self. And so through his writings, his big writings, he basically wrote the autobiography, kind of mirroring Augustine's Confessions, also writing about his inner struggle with kind of himself and who he is and his identity. And he says, for Rousseau, we are most ourselves when we act outwardly in accordance to that inner pristine voice of nature, because we are naturally free, independent beings. And so what Rousseau does is he says that the inner life, the inner psychology, that is where primary authority lies. That is who we are to conform to, that inner voice of nature. We have to move back towards that. And we are born free. And so for him, there's no concept of original sin. It's actually the opposite of that. We are born good. We are born free. We are born uncorrupted. And it is society's pressures on us that then kind of make us into bad people with bad characteristics. And so he lays the foundation, especially in educational kind of psychology that gets used up until now, for the primacy lying with kind of that inner voice of nature. And I think at this point it's maybe helpful for us to just discuss a bit how that correlates with a Christian view of understanding ourselves and kind of even the concept of original sin. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose the shift that happens, or not the shift that happens, but the difference between how we see who we are laid forth in Scripture, is that there's something external. Well, the authority lies somewhere external. So we're created, and we're created to be a certain thing, certain things, which means who we are. Our identity, our nature, is something which is dictated to us, given to us, for lack of a better word. It's not something which lies primarily internal. It's certainly not the case that the internal is kind of like ignored or nullified in the Scriptures or in the Christian worldview. But the internal is always, or search of the internal, understanding of the internal is always kind of, that's not the end goal. It's always somewhat directed outwards. What we are is corrupted by sin through original sin. And so even an absolute trust of the internal is on shaky ground in the Christian worldview, because we are not what we originally were created to be because of being corrupted by sin. I was supposed to put that on silence. And so even the thought of an absolute trust of myself and my inward feelings, it isn't really something which fits well with the Christian worldview. Because who we are is corrupted.
Yeah. I think Trueman deals with that pretty well, because he mentions, first of all, like, okay, creature created distinction. In the Christian worldview, that's there. It's actually important. We have been made by a creator. We belong to God as humans. And so he has created us to flourish, and that will look a certain way. And that is how he's designed human nature. And so the primary thing for us to do as creatures is always to submit under the Creator's guidelines. That's how a nail is designed to do a specific thing, and should be used in a specific way. He makes the example of a fish out of water. It's like a fish is free to be out of water, but he's not going to flourish out of water. And the one who really understands it is ultimately the Creator, which I thought was really helpful. But he also then like critiques Rousseau and says it's an absurd statement to make that humans are born free, because humans are almost from all the animals, even the most dependent on other people's help to survive. Humans are at every point, they need their mother's milk, they need care and love and attention. If you just leave a baby, they'll die. And so the concept of being so free and society is crippling. Trueman critiques that as that even the statement like that is crazy in and of itself. And so he kind of says, even though like a statement like that really doesn't make logically sense, it does have that idea has had like a huge influence in the culture. And that's why I think something that we ask ourselves, if we ask ourselves, what does the culture think? What is the average person around us? How do they understand themselves? How do they intuitively make judgments on things? What Rousseau is saying is something I've heard over and over again. This concept of nature being this pure thing, and we must return to nature, and kind of society is just like society's bad, and we just need to be pure. We need to move back to a purer sense of kind of being close to nature and all that stuff. And while there's some truth in some of what he's saying, I think there we see how Rousseau's influence is all around us. The statement that he makes that I read now let me just get it there, where he says we are most ourselves when we act outwardly in accordance with that inner pristine voice of nature. That is the concept of authenticity that we see everywhere around us. Everyone is called to be authentic. That's the thing, that we must be truly ourselves. We must be authentic to ourselves. And again, Trueman critiques that. He says, like, okay, must the murderer be authentic to his desire to kill? It's like, no, there's limits to that authenticity. That can't just be a free for all. But at least for Rousseau and the Romantics that he talks about afterwards, there was such a thing as human nature that did guide kind of basic morality, something that they all shared, empathy and sympathy, just because we are humans for one another. And that's where they would base their kind of moral judgments as to like what is helpful or not. But the next guys in the story that Trueman then speaks about is Nietzsche and Marx, and then he speaks about Oscar Wilde as being like the typical kind of Uberman that Nietzsche talks about of the age.
What's the shift that happens, or what's the contribution that happens from moving from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Marx and Nietzsche in the story?
Yeah, so the real shift, although Marx and Nietzsche have got completely different kind of worldviews, both of them deny any authority that comes with human nature. They claim that is kind of like that morality that we derive from human nature is made up. For Nietzsche, this is like the inner psychology just to survive, because if God is dead, then who are we? What are we going to do? It's a bit like nihilism. And so religion, kind of that morality plays a part just to keep us
like regulates.
Yes. But for Marx, again, morality is not linked to anything to do with human nature. He's got a materialistic worldview, but for him it has to do with the oppression. So the oppressed oppress the what do you call it? The oppressed.
Yes.
And they do that through specific moral codes that kind of for him was all seen in economic kind of way. And so that it all had to do with money and power in that sense. But those are the two major shifts. Although there's like way more to Nietzsche and Marx, both of them give the conceptual framework to deny any morality that's linked to human nature. Okay, so therefore all deeds, everything is up in the air as having any moral significance. So the sexual act itself, sex itself, is neutral. It is now kind of not based on ontology of being human, or kind of have any links to what it means to be human. And there, kind of that is where we then shift into, okay, what do we build our morality on? Like where do we move on after we've shifted away from kind of having any real human nature that leads to dignity for the other person. Yeah, so that's what Marx and Nietzsche kind of like bring to the table. And Trueman kind of uses Oscar Wilde as the typical kind of man that embodies that spirit of the age. And so I think I should say this like from the start, although we're like halfway in, we're not experts on the philosophers, by no means. This is Carl Trueman and the stuff I've read of him and engaged with some other thinkers. We're just gleaning from them and relaying kind of what we've learned. And so we by no means like understand everything they say, but it has been helpful for us in understanding our times. And so we share that with you, and you can make of it what you want. But I do think he gives a compelling case. But Oscar Wilde is the one that kind of like expresses in public this like inner his inner nature. And so he's the atypical homosexual rebel that stands against kind of like society. And he embodies that through the way he dresses, the stuff he writes, and his views and thoughts. And so he delves into that a little bit, why Oscar Wilde is such a kind of became such a figure in his day and age, which is interesting. I think at this point it would be helpful for us again to just discuss how dangerous that shift is in denying human nature. I think once we've denied that there's any innate human nature that leads to moral responsibility, I think we're on shaky grounds to have any sort of society that can function together. And I think it's completely at odds with the Christian understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God. Eh?
Yeah, so I mean, if we had to kind of like just step back and summarize a little bit where we are up until this point, off the back of some of these guys, you end up with a world where there's almost a question mark drawn over morality entirely. How do we know what's right or what's wrong? Where do we get that from? That's all. It's all ambiguous. It's moved. It's at this point at least moved entirely away from external sources of authority telling us this is right, this is wrong. There's no nature built into the way in which the world functions. There's no external authority, God telling us how to live. All of the morality that we've seen in the world up until this point, Marx, Nietzsche would say these are constructs, and they're social constructs, and they're constructs to achieve a certain purpose, right? For Marx, it's to keep the rich people rich and the poor people poor. For Nietzsche, I'm not sure. You know a little bit better.
Yeah, the way I understood it for Nietzsche, it was just to cope with the nihilism that leads from God being dead.
Right. Right. But it's man-made at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so you do end up at a point where morality in and of itself is question marked. This isn't a thing.
Yes.
No one tells us. And this perhaps moves us to conclude the first part of the argument, where who I am. Right, my identity, what makes me up, how I should live, how I shouldn't live, isn't something which is externally set forth in the world. Right, it's something. The self is psychologized. There's an internal kind of move that's happened from external things telling us how to live, who we are. That's done away with entirely, and there's a shift inward.
Yeah, and that's a major shift. 100 years ago, you would not, if you were to ask someone who they are, they would say, "I'm Francois Poe. I'm from South Africa. Live in Stellenbosch. This is my family. This is the work that I do." Where external kind of markers gave us our identity, and you could know not everything about me. And I think that's something that's helpful with the turn inward, to recognize that I am not my external situation. Like, what comes externally does not make me. I still bear like internal responsibility, and I have to engage with the world out there and my inner being. But for someone to turn away from external authorities being good and forming us, to turning external authorities are bad, it's a complete shift. You go to school. School was a place, an institution that was there to form you from being a child into a man, from being a child into a woman. And there's certain behaviors and characteristics that the school wanted to form in you through this educational process. Now that is flipped. The institution is not a place that now forms you. That institution now becomes a place where you perform. The purpose for the institution is to give you a place to express yourself. And so that's a complete shift in how we engage with the world around us. And that's why we can see such an erosion of external sources of authority that he deals with. And so he speaks about how the state or the nation state and how we understand that has completely weakened and changed. The church as an authority has changed. And what's the third one? The family, the nuclear family, and the way in which that has influenced us has changed quite a lot. And for me, the rest of the book goes on about the sexualizing of psychology and the politicizing of sex. But I think this is you don't have to agree with the rest of the book, at least to acknowledge that what we see around us is expressive individualism that's expressed by Charles Taylor, which Trueman relies on heavily here. And that's what we see all around us. It's what we see in ourselves. Yeah.
So I mean, this is the first time now that we've mentioned the phrase expressive individualism. It's a phrase that comes up very, very often throughout the book. We've spoken a little bit around some of the things touching on it, but we haven't actually, I mean, what is expressive individualism and how does it tie to this whole identity, authority things that we've been saying?
Do you want to give a shot at that one?
I'm not sure. But here goes. Let me try. This concept of expressive individualism is very closely connected to this idea of who we are, our nature, our identity, and the authorities. Who decides what is what? The authorities, not as in the authorities, but the authorities as in the things which do decide. Expressive individualism is the kind of end result of the shift that has happened, where rather than being who you are because of external authorities, say, having been created in a certain way, when the shift happens inward, the inner self, the psychologized self, now has the authority to decide who they are, right? And the way in which that comes about is through authentic inward expression. Yeah. So when inner feelings and desires are given primacy, then I am primarily those inward thoughts and feelings and desires, and therefore who I am is entirely dependent on me expressing what I'm feeling inside outward. And so this idea of expressive individualism is that idea of the individual self making itself, expressing itself to be who it feels it is.
I think that's a very adequate explanation of expressive individualism. Yeah, it's a term that's used to kind of summarize all these things that have come before from Rousseau and Marx and Nietzsche, everything together, to say this is the intuitions that the everyday person has. If you were to ask someone what is your worldview, they'd give you all the fluff, but if you pull it out, you'll get expressive individualism most of the time, where I am the one that's responsible for expressing my inner identity that I have, and everyone else should actually conform to that. Otherwise, you're denying my identity, which is what we're going to move on.
It may be good just to say at this point that as we speak about this stuff, expressive individualism and how we understand ourselves in the world and the kind of the pond that we're swimming in, so to say, it is a pond that we are swimming in. We don't speak about it as these people who think this way and they're crazy for thinking this way. As we've been talking about these things and reading this book for quite some time, something that has become clear is how much I am like this and how much I think like this. as a Christian, I certainly believe that God created me, created mankind to be a certain way, and He created the world to function in a certain way. And I certainly believe that I'm fallen because of sin, and I certainly trust Christ through His Spirit to continue to sanctify and renew me. But I feel this tension of me thinking this way, that I am my inner thoughts and feelings only or primarily, and that me expressing that is who I am. And so all I want to say is that as we speak about these things, we're by no means kind of speaking about them, looking down on the world and going like, these crazy people for thinking this way. We ironically are looking inward and going like, wow, this book is explaining us.
For sure. That's been a challenge. If you were a fly on the wall, like listening to our conversations, that's what you would hear so often. Me and Conrad get together and we're like, this is so true of us. We're like, this is me. And that's helpful, right? With any sin, with any wrong way of thinking, the first place to start is to acknowledge that, hey, this is what I struggle with. I do think like this. I do want to be my God, my own God, and make decisions for myself. I don't want to conform to kind of the way in which God wants me to live. I want to internally understand what God has to say, and then I want to psychologically be happy with it, and then I'll obey. But it's a good place to start. And again, Trueman does that. That's like the first thing he says. Like, the first thing we do is to recognize that we're complicit in this strange new world. But one of the things that I just think is like super helpful is, this is why it's so difficult for these intergenerational kind of discipleship to happen in the church, because not everyone thinks the same way. My dad, for instance, this does not describe my dad very well, but it describes me very well. And so for me to engage with my dad, if I have the assumption that my dad thinks the way I think, it's difficult to engage with him, because I'm going to think he's going to have all these inner feelings, and he's going to have this inner life that he's like subject to and wants to have, and he's just like not there. Where if he engages with me and doesn't recognize that that's where I'm coming from, then it's also difficult for him to work with me. And so I think this book, what it does is it helps us both as younger Christians to recognize the generational differences that are there in the church. And I think for older folk that are looking at today's world and thinking like, what is going on with the children of today? This will help explain a lot of that to, I think, come alongside instead of like talk down on. So for us, for you in youth ministry, for me with students, this is like the world we live in. But if you're 60 years old and you're kind of like dealing with the youth or with students, you don't know. This is a helpful book to actually just understand this is what's going on. This is what we've been taught at school. It's just been part of the air we breathe. So we wanted to have like this all done in one session, but I think this is a very helpful book, and we're going to conclude that and say that's part 1. And then we'll see you guys for part 2 and maybe even a part 3, who knows. But thank you so much for listening along with us. We are on Instagram. You go to bti.stellenbosch on Instagram, and there you can engage with us. I'll be asking some questions there that I'd love to get some feedback on. And so please follow us over there. And thank you for listening. Grace and peace. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Berean Bookclub podcast. We'd love for you to head over to your podcasting app and give us a review and subscribe to the podcast. It will help us so much. This podcast was brought to you by BTI Stellenbosch. BTI Stellenbosch exists to bring theology to the church. If you want to find out more information, you can head over to btistellenbosch.com. Until next time.